Well, well, well. That was a bit of a pre-celebration a few times, wasn't it? I think all of us can relate to right when we needed to focus on something very important we miss. Maybe you've been on your phone when the great line at the movie happened, or the great something to see already occurred. And I think it's about as easy to be distracted in our day than any day. And we, as followers of Christ, have got to remain focused on Him and focused on what matters. And I'm so grateful that God is patient with us in our lack of focus. Matter of fact, I don't know if you can sense this, but I've noticed many times in my life the Lord has refocused me. Sometimes through trial, and sometimes through blessing, sometimes through conviction of the Spirit. As we continue in our study of the book of Psalms this summer, I've arrived to one of my favorite that I've meditated on for years and really enjoyed the study of it this week. And Charles Spurgeon said this is one of his favorite psalms and the loveliest of the psalms. And today we're going to look at several ways that God refocuses us. This psalm, these 12 verses describe at least 12 different actions that God does. And many of them are aimed at the very clear goal of refocusing us. And so I want to first of all read verses 1 and 2 where we find these words, "How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts. My soul longs, yes, faints for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh sing for joy to the living God." Now, the first principle this morning about how God refocuses us is by, number one, by teaching us to prefer Him. As you look at this psalm, it's what we refer to as a psalm of ascent. It's a pilgrimage psalm where the writer, one of the worship leaders, the sons of Korah, wrote this song, and many folks believe that he had been away from the temple, away from worship, and he's marching back with great anticipation. And there is no place he'd rather be than in the presence of God, with the people of God, focused on God. And compared to anything else, as we'll see as this psalm goes on, he wanted to be with God. How many of your spiritual battle problems would be over if you preferred God above anything and everything else? Let's look at how he states that. First of all, he says, "How lovely is your dwelling place." Lovely is a word that probably ladies use more than men, I'd probably guess. It usually has to do something with appearance, although we do have some wonderful British people in our congregation, and I've noticed that the word lovely for the Brits means good, and it can mean real good. Matter of fact, have you noticed how many people from around the world have gotten new respect for America since the World Cup? Have you picked up on that? Maybe we're not as bad as everyone said, huh? I kind of lost interest in the World Cup after Monday night, but anyway. I did notice how the British, especially the British kids who have come here to have real live chocolate cake, are beyond themselves. And I was watching a post of some kid eating a piece of chocolate cake at some American restaurant, and he said, "Oh, Mother, it's lovely." So I'm jaded when I read this verse this week. I'm thinking of cake, and God wants me to think of Him. But anyway, how lovely is your dwelling place. What the psalmist is talking about is your presence. Now, it's more about a person than a location, but for the purpose of this psalm, it had to do with the place where they worship God. And it says that's the most beautiful place on earth. It's the most desirable place on earth. He describes Him as the Lord of hosts. We'll say that word again at the very end of our psalm in verse 12, but it means the Lord Almighty. It means the one who rules over all the armies of heaven. Notice in verse 2, when we talk about preferring God, we prefer the things that we desire and that we long for. My soul longs. If there's any request you should ask God, if you are either at the beginning of your Christian journey or at a place where you need to move forward, in a place of maybe coming back, I would ask God, if I were you, for a longing for Him. I was challenged to do that years ago. Lord, give me a great desire to be with you. And all I can tell you, brothers and sisters, that God often meets us at the point of our hunger. I will never forget God giving me a desire for himself, a desire for prayer, a desire for his word that I did not have. He gave it to me years ago as a result of me begging him for it. And here the psalmist says, I long for you. A Puritan writer observed that longings are one of the clearest signs that we know God, because a desire can't be faked. We can have a counterfeit. We can have counterfeit words. We can learn how to speak the right way on the outside. We can have counterfeit actions, can't we? We can do a seemingly right thing for the wrong reasons. But we can't have counterfeit desires, because desires are born on the inside. And longings are things we should ask God for. It also says, my soul longs, get this, yes, faints for the courts of the Lord. Fainting is essentially a result of not enough oxygen getting to our brains, and dizziness takes over and we pass out. I remember when Mrs. Lee and I were newlyweds, she was getting some blood work, and I went to get her blood work done with her. And as the needle goes into her, my dear bride of a few months passes out there. And I am going, what happened? What's going on? The nurse was saying everything's okay. She wakes up and says, oh, I didn't tell you I do that all the time. She acted like it was another day. I'm planning funerals after a few months of marriage. What's going on here? But for some of you, that you pass out when you do this, and when you get up too fast, and dizziness and fainting is commonplace. But this is not that kind of fainting. This is the kind of fainting where you are so struck by what's going on that you're overwhelmed. It is kind of like the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, or the Elvis in the early days, and the girls were just boom, passing out, except this is the good kind of passing out. It basically describes a consuming desire that is so driven by our heart that it can affect us physically. And I wonder if we ever worship God deep enough to where it has a physical effect on us. The courts of the Lord described, once again, the presence of God in a place, but we apply it to the person of God in our day. Notice this. It says, my heart and flesh sing for joy. This kind of shows the lack of reserve or reservation there is in the psalmist's worship. By the way, notice you have fainting, crying out, longing, and then you have joy. My heart and flesh sing for joy. Did you know that joy is not incompatible with other emotional elements in our worship? It's hard for us to be frustrated and sad and joyful at the same time, because sometimes our sadness, our anger, our frustration pushes joy out of the way. And that's why joy is much more than a smile on our face or a mood that we possess. It's an inner disposition that doesn't have to leave as soon as other things come in, like sorrow and suffering. And the lack of reserve here shows that the intimacy and depth of how much the psalmist wants God. And of course, he ends the passage in verse 2 by saying, to the living God. That mirrors what we studied last summer that I know you've not forgotten about from Psalm 42:2, where it says, my soul cries out for the living God. What does it mean that God is a living God? Well, of course, this was in juxtaposition to the false, dead gods of the idol-worshiping pagans. But it means that our God has real existence. That when the Lord described himself to Moses by calling him the name Yahweh, which means I am that I am, it means that God is alive, he's present with us, he's active, and he's eternal. You and I have such an honor to know that God is alive. He's the living God. We don't speak to a dead God. We don't serve a dead God. We joyfully serve the living God. Now, there's a second principle I want to point out this morning about how God refocuses us. And that's verses 5 through 7. Verses 3 and 4 are beautiful. David has a bit of envy for the sparrows. He says, even the sparrow finds a home there. I wish I could be a bird that hung out in the temple. But as he moves down to verse 5, he gives us a little more talk about the pilgrimage, the journey. And he describes God as providing all that he needed for the journey and for life, especially spiritually. In verse 5, he says this, blessed are those whose strength is in you, in whose heart are the highways to Zion. So whether this is a figurative or a literal travel, going to the Zion mountain of Jerusalem, he comes out with a statement in verse 5 at the very first part that we should not miss this morning. Blessed are those whose strength is in you. Have you ever... I'm going to ask you a question where you're going to look at me and say, duh, this is a daily thing, but have you ever gotten up a couple hours before your alarm went off? Can I get a witness out there? And you just know God's going to put you right back down to sleep. I had a couple of hours to play with this morning, and I said, Lord, I bet you're going to put me down right a little bit more, aren't you? And all I could hear in my head was this, blessed are those whose strength is in you. It's like he was basically saying, Cliff, you need to pray a lot more than you need to sleep, boy. And I am your strength. I'm going to be quoting this at noon as well, so I believe it'll fully hold up. But what a great thing that you and I don't live this life in a strength that is our own. All of us would fall on our face if we had to live this Christian life in our own power. And we are blessed, meaning favored and full of joy, because God's our strength. In verse 6, it says, as they go through the valley of Baca, they make it a place of springs. The early rain also covers it with pools. There's a bit of mystery about the valley of Baca. Some say it's an unknown ancient abandoned city. Others say it's imagery. I am kind of inclined to say it's imagery, although it doesn't really matter for our understanding of the text, because the word Baca means weeping. And so weeping is a part of this life. If not the physical tears, certainly the emotion of sorrow. And he says, as they go, worshiping pilgrims, expecting God, longing for God, as they go through the valley of weeping, they make it a place of springs. And the early rain also covers it with pools. So springs are where you want to go, where it's lush, where it's refreshing, when you are going through the valley of Baca. And I think the problem why our places of weeping don't turn into pools and springs is much of our own fault. Have you ever just refused to let your soul be comforted? I was in the room. Thank you for your prayers. Our kids at children's camp had a great week last week. And I was in the room on Monday when 50 kids were leaving our downtown campus and headed to children's camp. And there was a younger brother, maybe a kindergartner or a first grader, that wanted to go to camp with the big kids, and he couldn't go. And they'd already gone. I was kind of glad I wasn't getting on the bus with them, and I prayed them off and sent them off. But there's a little boy that was wanting to go on the bus with the big kids, and he was fussing. And his mother, I guess he fusses a lot. His mother was just talking to her friends as if that's a normal day. And I called the boy's name, and I said, hey, I saw something over here, buddy. You lost it, but I found it for you. He quit crying, looked up, and he said, what? I said, it's your happy heart. It's over here. Here you go. Take it. And it worked for a second. I would imagine as I walked down the hall back to my office, he started fussing again. And I started thinking of Psalm 77, where the psalmist said, my soul refuses to be comforted. Have you ever felt that way? Certainly as a fussy kid, but what about as a real life grown-up that your soul has refused to be comforted? One of the reasons why our soul refused to be comforted is not because we don't think God will help us. It's because we would rather focus on our problems instead of Him. And we tend to ruminate on our trouble, over and over, even the prayed over troubles, even the committed to him troubles, we feel like it's our duty to ruminate on them until we can think about nothing else but them. And what happens? Well, we stay in the valley of Baca. That's what happens. We never make it to the pools and the springs. We have to remember that every part of our journey, God has a specific plan for. And there is purpose in every valley of Baca that many times if we gather the spoils in the valley of weeping, he'll lead us into the pools of refreshment. Did you hear about the man that was running out of water in a desert area, and he was getting rather parched, and he looks up and he sees a band of Bedouins in the desert that were selling stuff, and he said, "Do you have any water?" And they said, "We don't have any water, sir, but we are selling ties. Would you like a tie?" He said, "No, water." Well, he walked a little bit further, and there's another traveling group of Bedouins who are salesmen, and he said, "Maybe they've got water." He goes, "Water, water." He says, "No, but we do sell ties. Would you like to sell you a tie? Would you like a tie?" "No, I want water." He walks a little farther, about as far as he can go. And he's wondering if this is a mirage, because out in the desert he sees a restaurant that is beautiful. It is flowing with beverages and tons of food. He walks up there and says, "I need water, water." And the man looks up and says, "Sir, you can't come in here without a tie." You know, there's things along the way we got to pick up. You might be in the middle of the valley of Baca right now, and you're in there weeping, and God's saying, "Hey, I'm bringing you to the springs. I'm bringing you to the pools," but you won't come out of the valley. Look at verse 7. It says, they go from strength to strength. Each one appears before God in Zion. What a beautiful description, isn't it? Strength to strength. I mean, it's not speaking physically, right? Because we don't go from strength to strength always physically. At the end of our lives, we do get weaker. And while we have great representations of people in our area they're amazingly strong, that's just part of life. When Paul said, outwardly we're wasting away, but inwardly we're being renewed day by day. But then Paul said, when I'm weak, I'm what? Then I am strong. He said that in 2 Corinthians 12, in verses 7 through 9, in some more unforgettable way. But what does the psalmist mean we go from strength to strength? Well, essentially what it means is spiritually, God has a reservoir of strength that is ours for the receiving, the asking, the taking every single day. But he doesn't spot us strength in advance. I never get tired of hearing the story and the testimony of Johnny Erickson Tada, great author and teacher and minister to those who are handicapped. She's a quadriplegic, as many of you know, since her accident at 17 years old in 1967. She's in her late 70s now, and had a diving accident where she became a quadriplegic. She was depressed, obviously, understandably, for the first few months after the accident, and then she got radically right with God. Now, she claims to this day that every single morning she begs God to give her strength because she doesn't have any. But she was noted as saying, in 1967, God did not bless me with 60 years of strength. He blessed me with a day of strength for that day. And that's what it means to go from strength to strength. God has a fresh supply of his power and strength for his people if we would look to him daily. If we receive it daily, we would go in God's power from strength to strength, even when we feel incredibly weak inside. Now, moving down to verse 10, this is a memorable take from the psalm. There was a song in the 90s an early praise chorus that said, "Better is one day in your courts than thousands elsewhere." Well, the writer didn't come up with that. He stole it from this psalm. In verse 10, it says, "For a day in your courts is better than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of the wicked." This gives us a third principle this morning. God refocuses us by offering the joy of serving him. Now, this verse means a lot more than serving God, but it certainly describes the joy that a servant had in the temple. And the Bible has a lot of analogies that describe quality versus quantity. Better is one day in where you are present than 1,000 elsewhere. We would probably say than 1,000,000 or a gazillion in our day, but thousands was a hyperbole of the Old Testament, than thousands elsewhere. He's describing the quality of God. Now, there are many areas of life where we want both quality and quantity. If you were to go to a restaurant and you ordered some meat to go with some sides, and the waiter or waitress brings out your meal, and you have a silver dollar sized piece of steak, and you just got a couple of questions. Is there something missing in the back there? Is this all the steak? Well, yes, sir, that's the size of the steak, but let me assure you, it is very high in quality. You're going to have a $50 bite on your plate. We want quality and quantity in many areas of life, don't we? But what the psalmist is saying here in verse 10 is there is tremendous joy in being in your presence, in serving you, and I would rather do that than anything else. Some of you have tasted that as you have ventured into sharing your faith with people that don't know him, as you have ventured out into being God's generous pipeline of blessing to others, as you've used your spiritual gifts to serve him in the body of Christ. You've tasted a bit of that joy. Notice this too: I'd rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of the wicked. One of the things the Bible does over and over again is that it accentuates the blessings of following God, and it mutes the temporary benefits of sinning. He's just saying, they act like they're having a good time in the tents of the wicked. But I've been there, and it's not that great, especially compared to this. Have you ever been tempted in such a way that the temptation by the enemy or the temptation in your sinful nature said, listen, if you do that, you're going to walk away with a really clear and good, peaceful conscience? No, that doesn't come up in temptation, does it? All that comes up in the temptation is the quick meeting of our pleasures, our senses to be satisfied for the moment. I was speaking with the director of our men's care center. Many of you know that we have men's and women's Christian rehabilitation centers at the Christian Care Center at our downtown campus. And there was one gentleman that had struggled after he left recently. And I said, well, what's going on with Paul? And he said, Paul was homeless for years. And homelessness is one of the scariest things for a lot of our guys. It's probably one of the scariest things for us to imagine for ourselves in this room today. But he says, if you've been homeless for a long time and you made it, and you are frustrated with all that it takes to live in this world and thus maintain your sobriety, well, homelessness is not that big a deal. And homelessness and addiction tend to fuel each other. And so this gentleman one day just kind of walked out of the place and didn't come back. Ended up having to go back to live stream, etc. And I was speaking with one of his brothers that really cared about him. He says, hey, pray for Paul because he's back in live stream and struggling. And he goes, I think what must have happened, Pastor Cliff, is he forgot how bad it really is out there. I started thinking, do you ever get that way? Do you ever commit a sin you realize you shouldn't have said, done, or thought that? And had you remembered how painful it is to sin against the holy God, you probably wouldn't have done it. And I think that the psalmist is doing something that all of us should do. You know how Paul talked about you reap what you sow, and you sow to righteousness, you reap great rewards. And death is multiplied when we sow to our sinful nature. It never satisfies. Just a great prayer for us to say, Lord, would you remind me of the blessings of obedience, and would you remind me of the emptiness of disobedience? That's some of what the psalmist is getting at here. But verse 11 stands out mightily. It says this, for the Lord God is a sun and shield. For the Lord bestows favor and honor. No good thing does he withhold from those who walk uprightly. Would you say that last sentence with me? Ready? No good thing does he withhold from those who walk uprightly. Well, y'all sound good out there. Goodness. Now, the principle there, number 4 on your outline, how God refocuses us. He refocuses us also by showing us his relentless goodness. Aren't you glad that that's one of the ways that God brings us back to him? It's not always with the rod. It's not always through discipline. Sometimes it's just through his nonstop goodness. Did you know that this is the only verse in the Bible that describes God as a son, S-U-N type of son? Probably that's not a commonly used metaphor because there were many ancient pagans that worshiped the sun god. And so maybe the Lord didn't want that to be a common confusion. But son works as a description of who God is, doesn't it? Because, you know, your phone ran out of juice at 7 p.m. last night, and the sun doesn't need a charger. The sun sustains its brightness on and on and on. It also gives light to everyone in this world. And God gives light to us. He is charged from his own being and own self. He's absolute, has absolute aseity and doesn't ever change, doesn't ever run out of anything. He is like the sun. And he's our shield, meaning he offers us blessing, but he offers us protection as well. Psalm 7:10, my God is my shield forever. Notice this, the Lord bestows favor and honor. So favor is a word that describes grace. What a great reminder to note that any good thing in our life is because of him. We run into foolishness when we think it's because of us or because of our great character, or because exclusively, independently of our own work. Now, let's not discredit the work that we did, but let's not forget that we did it with God's help. Whatever ability our mind has to operate effectively is from him. Whatever energy we had to put our hand to the plow and earn something was from him. Just always note that every blessing you have in life is from God. Not because you are Mr. or Mrs. Special. It is because the Lord bestows favor and honor. Now, this last verse that I had us read out loud a moment ago, this last phrase, it has some potential misfires on it, doesn't it? Now, first of all, I would imagine that the prosperity preachers on television and across the airwaves and in books that tell us that if you are a child of the King, he wants you to live like a child of the King. So name and claim and believe good things and they'll happen to you. And God wants you physically healthy at all times and personally wealthy at all times. You've probably noticed that I don't talk like that because I do not believe that at all. But I would say there are some verses that can be sort of hijacked to say something like that. And I notice there is a qualifying statement there that is not explained when it says, those who walk uprightly. There's a lot of read in there. There's not enough of a statement for us to overly read in. But a moment ago, I told you that the good things you have are from God and not because of you and your performance. Well, there is something to be said for when we are not walking uprightly, we miss out on God's blessings. That's true. And it might be that we miss out on them because they're there and we don't see them. It might mean that we miss out on them because we couldn't handle them, and so God did not give them to us when we're not walking uprightly. But what can we take from no good thing does he withhold from those who walk uprightly? We were blessed last week to have all of our kids and grandkids in town for the July 4th celebration. I've heard grandparents say through the years that they love to see them come and they love to see them go. I'm not saying that, but I just want you to know somewhere I can get what you're saying, you know. But once again, I'm not saying that. Anyway, it was on Saturday night, July 4th itself, when you might say Rue, which is Susie's grandma name, Rue's kitchen was rather flowing with good stuff. And a couple of the older grandkids, which is still real young, stayed up for the fireworks show that we had outside. And you might say that we weren't exactly monitoring their dessert intake real closely. There's a little bitty freezer outside that Rube fills with popsicles, okay? Ice cream sandwiches, and there's some other cookies and this. I don't want to go into it because you're already hungry from the steak analogy I used a minute ago. But so there's just good stuff. And one of our cute little girls, little Blakey, woke up in the middle of the night with what I might just politely call stomach issues, all right? And they realized, man, that girl, our grandparents were right when they told us you shouldn't have too much sugar. It's not good for you, especially late at night. So the next day, on Sunday, Blakey's wanting all the popsicles and all the goodies, and her parents, and I guess her grandparents, I would have probably given it to her had no one been looking, but they had to say no. No. You can't have that. You were sick. You got too much. Do you think Blake's like, I get it. I understand. No problem. That's not best for me. No. She's like, right? Now, I'm thinking that's exactly how we are. We want what we want because we want it and when we want it. And I wouldn't be surprised, brother, I wouldn't be surprised, sister, if there was a period in your life, or maybe you're in this period where you're begging God for a breakthrough, for a new relationship, or in a relationship, or in some kind of financial breakthrough, or maybe you remember wanting that perfect opportunity back in the day, and you brought it to the Lord, and He flat nixed it. He said no to you, and you had a problem with God giving you the X on your request. Why didn't He give it to you? I will tell you why, according to this verse, because it wasn't best for you. I can't get specific in your exact situation, but either we believe that no good thing does He withhold from those who walk uprightly, or we think that God is not telling the truth there, or we think that there's some deficiency. God not only will give us what is best, but the difference between God and us, one of the many, is that He actually knows what is best. And not only does He know what is best, He knows when it's best to give it out to us. And if we were supposed to have it, brother, sister, we would have it. And if we weren't supposed to have it, we don't have it. And so I would think that God should merit a little more trust and gratitude than all of the fussing that my granddaughter did last Sunday because she did not get the treat that proved it wasn't best for her. One more verse to look at today that in some ways summarizes much of the psalm. Verse 12, it simply says, O Lord of hosts, blessed is the one who trusts in you. Now the word trust means to lie down on or to put weight on. I have this memory as a kid that my friend, I was at his house, I was in grade school, and behind his house was a little forest, kind of a little wooded area, and we were playing in his backyard one day, and we bumped up against a tree, and I remember pushing this tree, and it started moving down. It was obviously an old, dead tree with no root left, but he saw me do that. He thought I was Superman. I was Christopher Reeve. 1978, I was Superman right in his backyard. And we looked at the tree that it was now leaning over. And the area where it was about to fall could handle it. It was not near any edifice. And so he and I went out, we finished that tree off. We pushed it down, walked around going, But what was the deal with that tree? Well, it was a very untrustworthy tree in the sense that it couldn't handle any weight. So if you say to someone, hey, listen, trust me, just trust me. In other words, the weight of my words is something that you can buy into. When God says, trust me, He means that the weight of your cares, the weight of your anxiety, the weight of your problems doesn't have to be on you. The full weight can be on God. Our problem is, do we think that God's like that decrepit little tree in the forest that I pushed down as a kid? Or do we think God can handle the pressures of our life? This verse kind of quietly gives us two reasons of why we should trust God. The first reason is because of who He is, O Lord of hosts. NIV says, "O Lord Almighty." You and I can trust God because he is the Lord Almighty. He's the one who rules all the armies of heaven. He's filled with sovereignty, meaning control over all things, wisdom and love, and he's the Lord of hosts. So if we believe who God says he is, he's trustworthy. Also, the second reason we can trust God, according to this verse, is because we will be blessed if we do so. Blessed meaning that overflowing sense of joy and contentment in God is ours when we trust him. I'll tell you this right up, and you might feel the same way. I have never regretted trusting God. But I have big regrets for not trusting him. I never have any. Have you ever trusted the wrong person? Like, man, I shouldn't have trusted that guy. I shouldn't have trusted that snake oil salesman. I shouldn't have trusted so-and-so who blabbed everything to everybody. I have never said, man, I shouldn't trust a guy. What was I thinking? I've been blessed every time I trusted God. And I don't mean blessed financially every time I trusted him on the spot. I don't mean blessed that there weren't any difficulties from trusting him. Sometimes there is difficulty in trusting him, but I'm blessed every time because doing what he says fills me with such inner vigor. It's amazing. God can be trusted because of who he is, and he can be trusted. He should be trusted because of what he brings to those who trust him. That last principle this morning, how God refocuses us, is by giving us reasons to trust him. There's some reasons why you should trust God this morning. If you're not a child of God, never have trusted him for salvation, I encourage you to trust him with your life, to trust your sins to the cross, to trust your hope for eternal life in him and him alone. I encourage you to trust him if you're a fellow pilgrim on the journey of life. Instead of going from strength to weakness, you can go from strength to strength because you're trusting in the one that says, blessed is the one who trusts in him. As we take a moment to enter into a time of response, I'd like us to bow together as our campus pastor Shannon leads us in a time of invitation today.